I know, against my better judgment, I've decided to make another video, but here we are. We'll get through this together.
Wait a minute. How did this happen? We're smarter than this.
And the reason I've decided to make another video is because you hear people all the time saying, oh, this is Star Wars, or something will happen in like Revenge of the Sith and they'll go, oh, that just isn't Star Wars to me. That's such an abstract thing. Like, what is Star Wars? And it means different things to different people. I just found it really interesting about what it is for different people, and if there's a definitive answer to what is or isn't Star Wars, and if not, why certain people think the way they do about the question. And first, I think it needs to be said that Star Wars has been around at its peak for 3 different generations. So what it means to you and how you'll react to others depends in some way on what trilogy you grew up with. But I find it fascinating that some things some people will love in one era, they'll hate in another, and when looked at on a basic level as sort of serving the same need. So if you're to ask someone whether they like the Ewoks, they'll probably say yeah. And then if you ask someone if they like Jar Jar Binks, they'll probably say no, because what they're doing is they're going back to how they viewed it in the 80s when they were watching Return of the Jedi. And that's not the case for everyone, because a lot of Star Wars fans weren't born in the 80s that like the Ewoks and that don't like Jar Jar. But I think it's interesting when you look at it in terms of just the purpose of the characters. Like, if you look at the Gungans and the Ewoks, they're sort of doing the same thing, but I think it goes to execution and context. There was a big thing about how the original trilogy was so practical effects heavy, and that was something that got pushed aside for the prequels. But there's always been a reliance on CG, even since A New Hope. But viewers took an issue with all the green screen work in The Phantom Menace. And what's interesting is how technology comes back around and changes, and that's exactly what it's done in The Mandalorian, which you could say is almost the same vibe as the original trilogy, coming back around and changing. But with that, we have the volume, which is sort of like a glorified green screen, but everyone, rightly so, marvels at it and is so happy with that. But with all the green screen work in the prequels, it's no, this isn't Star Wars, this isn't what we're here for. And calling the volume a glorified green screen is making it sound less impressive than it actually is. But it's just that is praised as yet another part of The Mandalorian's production, that people seem to think, oh, it's getting back to Star Wars roots and not a hindrance like it was for the prequels. What got me thinking about this was an episode of the Book of Boba Fett where there was a tweet about the biker gang. It was just a picture of them, and the tweet said nothing about this picture is Star Wars. And I didn't particularly like the biker gang in the Book of Boba Fett, and especially the episode with the chase, which was, I think, the episode this tweet came after. But I wouldn't say that they're not Star Wars, and that's what got me thinking about doing this video, because I think there's a difference between not liking something and not thinking it's Star Wars. I tried to think hard about why that is, but what is and isn't Star Wars is such an unobtainable thing, and yet people are so certain of it. I think it comes down to how it's presented, because if you put that same biker gang near enough the same chase and put them in an episode of the Clone Wars, like maybe it's the Underworld of Coruscant, I don't know, something like that, I think it'd fit right in. So I think it's all about the context of where it is. Maybe the mods and the bikers being on Tatooine, maybe that person didn't think they gelled, and that's why they came to that conclusion that it wasn't Star Wars. But to me, it wasn't that they weren't Star Wars. I think it was about context. I think it was about the context. Maybe it's disrupting the idea of Tatooine, whereas you wouldn't even bat an eyelid if they were chasing past bounty hunters in Coruscant. I don't know. And I'm not sure if that person didn't like the prequels or not. Not liking elements of the prequels is fine, but not liking it and it not being Star Wars is a very big distinction that needs to be made. But some people who are a big fan of Legends are always talking about certain elements that need to be brought over into canon because they are what they view as peak Star Wars. And I think that's a lot to do with people who grew up without Star Wars after Return of the Jedi. When that was it was done until the prequels came around, and then even after that, with that in mind in the future, that was it. It was just going to be those 6 films. So when all you've got of extended universe material is the novels, and you latch on to so many of these ideas, and then all of a sudden you get told we're making loads more shows, loads more movies, Disney come in and they go, just the 6 movies and the Clone Wars is canon. That can disrupt your idea and your equilibrium a bit of what is Star Wars to you. But a lot of the legend stuff, from what I've seen, I'm not quite sure why people want to bring it in. I mean, yeah, there's great stories and great characters. They still exist. I think a lot of things that would be brought over with that in mind first, and then trying to work the story around it. I think one of the great examples, as much as people dismiss Dave Filoni for a lot of things, one of the better choices he made creatively was when they were making Rebels. They were trying to get Starkiller in from Force Unleashed games, and they were working out how to get him in, and obviously they had to change the character a bit if they were to do it, and the plan was to bring him in, I forget which season, but then they realised that he just wouldn't fit. They'd just be bringing him in to bring him in, and it wouldn't actually serve the story, so they got rid of him. And I think that probably would be the case with a lot of the Legends stuff, is that the idea would be to bring that in and then work out how, instead of finding a story and then going, oh, actually, if we brought this over, that could work really well. That being said, a lot of people, myself included, really like the new canon novels, and I think someone who doesn't read the novels, don't have to read the novels, doesn't make them less of a Star Wars fan than someone who does. But someone who reads the novels, they might be their favourite bit of Star Wars because it's given them something that the movies isn't. And then I think, again, it just goes back to what type of fan you are. But for some, the new canon novels are Star Wars, and to others, Legends is Star Wars, and then to most, it just isn't. I wasn't really going to go too much into my own opinions on certain stuff in this video, not sure why. And as the times passed, I thought, why not? One of the biggest things that go into this question on what is Star Wars in recent years has been all the discourse around The Last Jedi, and that's really what divided the fan base for many years, and probably is still divided over now, even though I don't think there's that many people, contrary to what people believe, that really hate it, and hate it that badly that they want it to be remade, like that petition that got put around the time of its release. But there are people who don't like it, just a normal amount, and are sensible about it, but they still don't like it, and they go about the criticism in the right way. But I do find it weird about the main issue people take with it, and that's about the characterization of Luke. And I think it didn't help matters when Mark Hamill came out, I think it was before the film, and basically said he wouldn't have chosen that path for Luke. Words to that effect. Actor thinks this about character, I don't think is the right reason to take as gospel on why something doesn't work. At the end of the day, the actor, yeah, they might know the character, and I'm not saying Mark Hamill doesn't know the character, but to say that Mark Hamill is right and only knows the right way forward for Luke, I don't think that's correct. But from the film, people say that's not the Luke we wanted, that's not what Luke would have done. And I think that goes back to what they imagined Luke would be like after Return of the Jedi. And as far as we know, what Luke was like after Return of the Jedi is what they thought he was. This just isn't straight after Return of the Jedi. And the character's changed and grown and done different things. And to me, Luke in The Last Jedi absolutely stays true to who he is as a character, and actually does something more interesting with the character than I thought they would have done, and what people would have been asking for. And then this wasn't helped in The Mandalorian, which I think not purposefully but accidentally panders to the people who hate The Last Jedi in a toxic way anyway. And then when Luke comes back in the season 2 finale and is literally the pinnacle of what people thought he should have been anyway, then, you know, everything else goes out the window. But I just don't understand how people want this really bad CG deep faked voice modulation version of Luke than a recast, or as an older Mark Hamill doing something vastly more interesting and nuanced, I think, than Luke just going around killing people with a lightsaber, which is cool to see, but I don't get why we can't have both. Kathleen Kennedy said something recently about recasts, basically that they don't need them anymore, and I think that's such a bad take and a wrong take, and especially when you've just done an Obi-Wan show with a recast. Ahsoka has just been recast, and I see people saying, oh, now if they bring Solo back and they don't need Alden Ehrenreich because we can just do what they did with Luke for Harrison Ford and do it that way. But then Kathleen Kennedy says something like, oh, but we can't wait to work with Donald Glover as Lando. There's contradictions all the time, and I just don't get why someone would want the version of Luke from The Mandalorian as every recast. Young Leia in Obi-Wan was an absolute triumph, and I think probably the best thing about that show in the end. You cannot tell me that bringing in someone else as Luke would not have been better than that terrible voice modulate. It's, to be honest, it's mainly the voice. I mean, yeah, and in the Book of Boba Fett, that episode, they keep cutting away as much as they can from Luke's face, and it does look better in that. But it's honestly, it's the emotionless voice for me that I just don't understand why you wouldn't want someone bringing a proper performance to that, rather than this lifeless AI nonsense. And that's why I think the question, what is Star Wars, and why it was probably silly of me to even attempt to try and break it down, is because I'm no further from finding out what is and what isn't since I started making this video. But it's still interesting, and why the question sort of is a moot point, because Luke in The Last Jedi to some people is absolutely not Star Wars, and some people, like me, Luke in The Last Jedi is like the pinnacle of Star Wars, whereas some people, that film just doesn't do it for them. And then others, Luke in The Mandalorian is absolutely what they want from Star Wars, and to me that's what I want to get away from. I don't really know what the conclusion of this video is, apart from me learning absolutely nothing and probably making no points of any consequence. But I think it's just interesting that something so close to people's hearts, and a definition of what if Star Wars is fact, means something completely different to everyone. And I think that's something to be celebrated. It's just when all the toxicity comes in that it doesn't go too well. But we all love Star Wars in all of its forms, one way or another, and I think that might be the message to take from this, if there is a message from whatever this was. Anyway, I'll see you in the next one, if there is a next one after this video, if you can even call it a video. Who knows what this was.